Thank you, Minister. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Robert Glasser, Head of the Climate and Security Policy Centre for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Dr. Glasser's presentation will explain why climate change is rapidly increasing the risk of natural disasters. He will highlight the need to increase the resilience of heritage buildings, streetscapes, and cultural heritage in anticipation of the likely unprecedented scale of rapidly emerging climate impacts.
Hello, I'm Robert Glasser. It's my great pleasure to be here with you virtually in this case for the 2022 Regional Heritage Conference, Be Prepared. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person, but unfortunately I'm traveling overseas. I'm overseas at the moment, so couldn't join you, but I really appreciate the opportunity to make some comments. And I'm particularly upset that I'm not there to join you because it would be great to visit York, which I know is the oldest inland town in Western Australia, so with rich cultural heritage that in our increasingly climate-affected environment needs to be protected. I have a presentation for you today. I've been asked to speak for about 40 minutes. That's a long time, so I'll do my best to keep things moving briskly. And I wish I, again, could be there with you. I'd love to have a discussion with you afterwards and hear your comments or answer questions if you had any. So the title of my presentation is Climate Change, Natural Disasters, and Community Resilience. And let me begin by acknowledging country where I am currently. I am very honored to be presenting these comments from the ancestral lands of the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional custodians of this land, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. Talk about heritage, huge heritage. And I pay respects to the Ngunnawal elders past, present, and those emerging. I also, of course, want to acknowledge the Shire of York that is hosting this meeting in wonderful York, which I hope I'll have an opportunity to visit someday soon. And of course, I want to acknowledge the Heritage Council of Western Australia and the WA Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, who are presenting this important meeting here today. Now, in my presentation, what I'd like to do is touch on four main points. The first is some climate science findings. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of technical science. I'm actually not a climate scientist, although I have many friends who are, but I do think it's important to understand some critical features of the climate and how it's changing to understand the scale of the challenge we have ahead of us, and it's an enormous challenge. The second point I want to focus on is an element of the way the world is changing and Australia is changing. I'd like to focus on these compound hazards, these extreme events that are going to be hitting not one and then a year later another, but virtually simultaneously or one right after the other, which has a major impact on infrastructure and community resilience, as I'll mention in a moment. And these increasingly will have these cascading impacts across local communities, regionally, and even nationally, as we've seen recently with the floods and Black Summer. Thirdly, I want to talk about how we build a more resilient Australia, and finally end with some reasons for optimism, because there's a lot of bleak information out there, but there are also important reasons for optimism. So with that, let me begin with a picture of Wujal Wujal. Wujal Wujal is an Aboriginal community in far north Queensland. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. I'm on the board of the Queensland Reconstruction Authority that rebuilds after disasters. And one of the wonderful things about being on this board is that we get to visit these often remote rural communities that are recovering from major disasters. And in this case, I visited Wujal Wujal shortly after the massive floods that affected Queensland in 2019. They were record-setting floods. And we went to this beautiful, beautiful Aboriginal community We were greeted by Uncle Billy, who took us up to their sacred, we met him at his sacred waterfall, sacred site, and they gave us the welcome to country and smoke ceremony. But then subsequently I was chatting with people, and this flood was unprecedented the way it came through the town. It basically divided the community in half, with the elderly members of the community on one side of these floodwaters and the rest of the community on the other. And the younger members had to ferry through chest-high water to carry the elderly to safety, while the local crocodile had free rein through the water. So it was a very harrowing time. But one of the other elders told me that in the middle of this massive flood, Uncle Billy was up at the sacred waterfall, throwing debris back into the water and yelling at his ancestors, "Why didn't you warn us about this? Enough, enough." So here's a community with tens of thousands of years of history and memory transferred through songlines and stories, and there was no precedent, no warning for the scale of this hazard. And that's increasingly what's happening now with climate change. It's magnifying the scale of these hazards beyond certainly anything in Western memory, and even in cases of communities such as Aboriginal communities that have been in Australia for more than 50,000 years. So the next, I want to now go to that first point that I mentioned earlier about the climate science. And there are three main points that it's important to appreciate with the science. The first is that regardless of what we do, if every single factory stopped producing greenhouse gas tomorrow, the climate will continue to warm because of the warming, the greenhouse gases that have been released in previous decades. It takes a long time for those gases, the effect, to work through the climate. So what this means is that climate change isn't like pollution from cars, where if you switch to unleaded petrol and put catalytic converters on cars, the air quality will improve. We're on track for probably over 1.5 degrees of warming. It will be really difficult, perhaps impossible, to limit warming below 1.5, which was the lower limit set in the Paris Climate Agreement. So we're committed to major climate impacts. Regardless of what we do now, the hazards are going to increase. And they're going to increase, and this is the second point, we're going to be surprised at how quickly they increase, because the pace, the science tells us, is increasing non-linearly. So it's human nature to think what we've seen in the last 10 years with these climate impacts is what we can expect over the next 10 years. But that's wrong. The pace is accelerating, and that is going to surprise us with the scale of these impacts. And then the third bit of the climate science that's important to understand, and I want to spend a few more minutes talking about this, is that even very small climate impacts that seem small can have big impacts across society. And communities will be surprised by the scale of these impacts as well. And let me illustrate that with the next slide. Okay, well, this is a picture. If you look back over the last 10 years, extreme heat events have increased 20-fold increase in these record-setting heating events relative to the previous 30 years. And that's from less than 1 degree of warming. Now, I want to play this slide for you in a moment that will demonstrate how quickly this is changing. And if you look on the screen at the slide right now, this is a typical distribution of, you have most of the normal weather in the middle. That's where most of the weather is. Then you have on the tail to, I guess it'll be on your left, the extreme cold, and on the right, extreme heat. And you have basically the same amount of extreme cold and extreme heat in a normal climate and unaffected by climate change. Now I'm going to play this slide, this film, so you can see how that changes, how quickly things are shifting. So I'm going to play it now, and you'll see basically the years tick by. This is 1950s, 1960s, 1970s now, and you see it starts shifting to the right now very quickly, and then more and more and faster as we approach the present time. So when you look at this now, you can see that the area of extreme heat, that area to the right, even though the shift has only been less than 1 degree of warming, it has a massive increase in the amount of extreme heat events on the planet. And so this really illustrates, this is only, I've stopped the slide at 2003, but that trend has continued with these record-setting extreme heating events. So a very small change has a big impact. Now let me give you one other example of this, extreme flooding. Sea level rise, if you have, the science will tell you, the geology and engineering will tell you that if you have a 10 centimeter sea level rise, which is a relatively small amount, what was previously a 1 in 100 year extreme flooding event becomes a 1 in 33 year event. With a 20 centimeter rise, it becomes a 1 in 11 year event. And soon it will become annual events in many parts of the world, and actually even more than annual events, plural. The UN Climate Science, this authoritative source of climate impact, says that we're on track for at least 30 centimeters by 2050. So very soon we're going to see these 1 in 100 year events become annual events. And of course, 1 in 50 year events are becoming will be even more likely to be annual events. So again, a very small change, but a huge impact on society. This is a picture of Lismore floods. Just to give you an indication of this, we've had record flooding during a La Nina year, which generally means more flooding on the eastern coast of Australia, but also with climate change, on the back of climate change, where with a warmer climate, you have much more moisture in the air that can then fall in storms, in cyclones and the like. And this is the scale of flooding that we're seeing. This is what we're seeing on our northern doorstep already. This is from the Philippines, but you could look at pictures from Indonesia as well, these absolutely enormous flooding events on a huge scale that will increasingly, Indonesia is 200 kilometers away from Australia at its closest point, So increasingly these problems that begin accelerating in our region will also be affecting us directly. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this UN body that does the authoritative science, asked, or the international community asked scientists to say, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming? That seems like a really small difference, 0.5 degrees, but we'd like to know what the implications are for humanity. And the report they produced, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in these numbers, but they've essentially assumed with that 0.5 degree warming that it's a 50% increase in water stress, 420 million more people exposed to heat waves, again, that extreme increase in heat waves, 270 million more exposed to severe water scarcity, and a tenfold increase in people exposed to decreases in crops, increasing by 30-fold if you go from 2 degrees to 3 degrees, and additional 100 million people at least falling into poverty globally. So small changes have big impacts. Now, this is the second item on my agenda for our conversation today, or one-sided conversation, is the focus on these compound hazards and the cascading impacts they'll have. This is a hugely overlooked risk. Even the scientists say, we can tell you what impact extreme heat will have on wheat crops, but it's very hard to say what the combination of extreme heat, flooding, more frequent fires, storm surge, more cyclones, the range of hazards that climate change is amplifying simultaneously, how all of that affects food security, but it certainly will affect agriculture, for example. And climate change is increasing the risk of these events happening simultaneously and also having rippling effects that go much farther, much more widely than the local community where they might be felt initially, because climate, as it warms, is increasing the severity and frequency of these sudden onset hazards like floods and bushfires, but it's also changing the pattern. The bushfire season is lengthening. Cyclones are now will begin tracking further south to parts of the country that have never had to with structures that haven't been built to withstand strong winds. If you look in the US, Hurricane Harvey, over half of the homes that were destroyed in the flooding caused by that event were outside of the 1 in 500 year flood zone. So the pattern is changing where the hazards are striking. And then when you have these sudden onset things like floods and bushfires interacting with drought consecutively, communities don't have time to recover from the slow onset one. They're buffeted by the sudden onset ones, and it really degrades resilience. Now, I want to give you some examples of how these compound and cascading hazards are happening globally, and then also give you some examples here in Australia. And in 2010 and 2011, there was an atmospheric blocking event over Russia that scientists have connected to climate change, that it was more likely as a result of climate change. It led to this record heat and drought that contributed to the outbreak of major fires in Russia. Now, I'll say something about that in a minute, but at the same time, that blocking event on the other side of the world in South Asia affected the subtropical monsoon and caused massive flooding. In this case, this photo is some examples of the flooding in Pakistan. 20 million Pakistanis were affected by this humanitarian crisis. At the same time in Russia, the extreme drought and heat contributed to the outbreak of bushfires that killed hundreds of thousands of Russians from the direct immediate impacts, not the long-term impacts. People don't really realize the scale of the destruction caused by that fire. It also affected their wheat crop, and as a result, Russia instituted an export ban to protect the domestic supply. China made a huge purchase to protect its own domestic supply, and in the meantime, the Ukraine's wheat supply was affected by the same drought and heat, as was China's, and Australia and the US were affected during that period by extreme floods, also during a La Nina year, as we're experiencing now. And so there's a big spike in the price of food, and ultimately that wasn't the cause of the Arab Spring, but it led to rioting, contributed to rioting, where the calls of the people on the street were bread, freedom, and social justice. So you have a climate impact contributing to multiple events on different parts of the world and on these cascading impacts on political stability and conflict. Governments were swept away in the Arab Spring, and climate was a contributing factor. I want to focus now, give you 3 examples from here in Australia, and actually I could use a 4th. The floods we're currently still experiencing on the East Coast in particular. But in 2020, we had a bushfire crisis, as you know, in Australia. Ultimately, again, there was record drought with record heat that contributed to the outbreak of fires that then, because of those other factors, were so intense that they generated their own weather, these pyrocumulonimbus fire phenomena that then triggered lightning and spread the fires as the front moved. So it actually generated its own fire weather, in effect. 24 million hectares of Australia burned in that event. Hundreds of Australians lost their lives from the immediate impacts and the longer-term impacts together. And this wasn't just a massive fire on a major scale. It was an air quality crisis. In Canberra, the air quality was so bad you could not see the building next door to you. The air quality was the worst in the world at that point, and extremely hazardous air quality. So it was an air quality health crisis. It was a biodiversity crisis in the biodiversity that was destroyed. It was an economic crisis in that tourism, anyone who planned to come to Australia to visit the Great Barrier Reef or the like canceled their plans. It almost became a water security crisis because the fires, you may remember, threatened Warrangamba Dam at one point, which supplies most of Sydney's water supply. So again, simultaneous hazards, record-setting events that trigger these cascades. Similarly, in the Queensland summer before that, and that's when I was up in Wudjil, there was I was talking to some colleagues who were rebuilding roads after the cyclone that had affected Queensland the year before, And they said, we're in the ironic situation of rebuilding roads following floods, and we can't find enough water to suppress the dust and to mix with the gravel to make the roads, because there was a drought at that point. So these consecutive events, and in this case in Queensland, there was extreme drought, extreme heat, record-setting heat that triggered again the outbreak of fires. The fires burned 1 million hectares of land, which was the largest extent burned in Queensland's recorded history anyway. There was a Cyclone Owen then struck shortly afterwards, which dumped more rain than Melbourne receives in a year in some parts of Queensland. That didn't break the drought. That happened a bit later when this trough settled over northern Queensland, which then generated immense flooding, including in Wujal, floods that killed hundreds of thousands of drought-stressed cattle. So again, it's not that Australia, clearly we have experience with droughts and floods, but what's happening now is the record-setting level of these events and the frequency and severity increasing. And I won't talk about Tasmania because we're short of time, but there was a marine heating event, a drought, led to fires in World Heritage sites. It affected the hydro water industry. It affected the farmed seafood industry, and it resulted in a decrease in Tasmania's the expected gross state product by close to 50%. So huge impact. Now, what do we do in this situation in which climate change is hugely amplifying these hazards, not just their scale, but their frequency and how rapidly this change is now upon us? And as I said earlier, we're committed to at least 1.5 degrees of warming. So we're committed, as sad as this is, to some major increasing impacts of these hazards. Regardless of efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, we have to prepare for these. And there are some great things that can be done. And our heritage sites are absolutely fundamental in this. They are not only a source of great pride to communities, but they're a source of great interest outside of communities as a tourism feature, and therefore a major aspect of the local economy and supporting the economy, and of the connection between the present and the past. That heritage, which Aboriginal communities know far better than we do, is so fundamental to our identity and to our sense of connectedness to land. And so, yes, these hazards will be affecting heritage, infrastructure, and other aspects of heritage in really fundamental ways that we need to be prepared for. And there are some great examples globally. My job with the UN, I was the special representative of the Secretary General's for disaster risk. So it gave me a priceless opportunity to visit communities all over the world and see what people were doing to reduce the risk of disasters. And there are huge things they need to prepare for because, as I mentioned, the regional impacts are going to affect food security, they're going to affect political stability, cause climate refugees, and these things will affect us as well, but they need to begin preparing, as do we, for these hazards. So there's some great low-tech solutions. For example, in Vietnam, communities are building mounds so that when the floods happen, they can evacuate their livestock to mounds, these mounds of earth. So it's not a high-tech solution, very low-tech, but it works very well. They're similarly switching from chickens to ducks because ducks float. Again, it's just a simple adjustment that can be made that they are making to respond to these challenges, these hazards that are increasing. In Thailand, the former king had a program called Monkey's Cheeks, which was the idea that across the country, people would build dams, which would then flood when the rains came. And when the rains receded, they would be cold water for drinking water, but also for fish ponds for the community. It was a way of building resilience in a very low-tech way to these hazards. There are also some great high-tech examples of this. In Manila, SM Prime, which is one of the large financiers of malls, shopping malls around the world, well, in China and in Southeast Asia in particular, the head of that company Hansi took me on a tour of a shopping center in Manila that he designed to flood. So the whole basement, the car park, is designed to flood. All of the pillars, support pillars, are round so the debris slips by instead of catching. There are pumps that accelerate the drainage. And this mall essentially becomes an oasis for the community when there's flooding in Manila. It's probably also good for business because it's a captive audience or market, but it's still a remarkable, it's clearly high tech, it was expensive, but he felt it would pay for itself, and I'm sure it will. And of course, in Australia, we have both low tech, high tech, and traditional, non-traditional approaches, such as the traditional fire management practices of Aboriginal communities. Now, one of the key challenges as we build our resilience in this changing world is to take account of these compound hazards and cascading impacts. So we have to not just prepare for individual events, but how they might combine and have a much greater impact on our communities around the world, around Australia and around the world. And one of the things we need to do absolutely is when we do have disasters and we are rebuilding, we have to automatically embed in the rebuilding the idea of building back better, of making sure that our betterment funding is there to enable us not to rebuild the bridge in the same place or the flood control measures in the same way, but to take account of the hazards and strengthen the resilience of those investments that we're making. Secondly, we have to incorporate climate change in our risks. Currently, a lot of our flood maps and hazard maps, as I think I was hinting at earlier, don't incorporate climate change. And unless we do that, we're missing the fact that these hazards are changing, where the patterns are changing and the severity is changing. That example of Hurricane Harvey in the US, but we're seeing it in Australia as well. So we need to begin doing the best we can. It's hard to do, but to incorporate our understanding of how climate is changing these hazards. Instead of just relying on the history to determine what our risk is, we now have to think about the future and the past. And thirdly, we're going to have to sadly think of these really transformational measures like land swaps, relocating communities. Grantham, Queensland, for example, after a major flood, relocated the community up onto hills. In the current floods, those people that had moved were high and dry. There were about 50 homes in the flood area still, and they were overwhelmed by the scale of the floods we've had this year. So we have to begin thinking about relocating even communities that are at extreme risk, particularly with climate change, and basically begin thinking about planned retreats from places. And the other thing is, of course, and I know probably everyone in the room for this meeting understands this, that a community's disaster resilience is not just about strengthening infrastructure, it's fundamentally linked to the community's economic and social resilience. If key businesses leave, then there's no income to do anything in the community to build resilience. So these things have to be integrated with the economics, with the social issues, the mental health issues, which are enormous when you have repeat disasters and you're buffeted, consecutively or even simultaneously with these events. And we've seen this in Black Summer, and we've seen this in COVID, certainly the increases in domestic violence and the like, and the post-traumatic stress issues. So it's a very complex challenge, but it is possible to make progress. And one of the things I've observed globally is that if you want to make progress, you have to find some fire for change. Where's the fire to get people motivated to do things, or that motivates politicians to act? And one of the fire for change can actually literally be fire. What I've seen globally is after usually improvements in resilience globally happen really slowly and incrementally, with the exception of moments where there are big disasters. And right when the big disaster strikes, the public is angry, they want action, the money flows, and it's possible to make these step change improvements in relocating infrastructure or strengthening its resilience, heritage areas where part of the heritage is the location, so strengthening the resilience to the hazards in ways that enable the infrastructure to survive. And this of course applies to an individual. If I've just experienced a flood as a farmer, I'm going to be more interested in putting in place measures to prevent future floods or fire or whatever it is. If I haven't experienced that in 20 years, I've got so many other priorities. I've got to fix the tractor. I've got to, there's a long list. I'm not going to take it seriously. And similarly, LGAs, communities, if they haven't experienced recent big disaster events, it's hard. You'll see in their strategic plans, you won't see disaster risk reduction feature. So one of the ways is to target these communities that have had recent disasters as the opportunity to make progress. And the same applies at a national and state level. Black Summer, there have been huge new investments in resilience as a result of Black Summer. The federal government feeling the heat, literally and figuratively and politically, from these fires, investing huge amounts of money in helping communities recover. And just to point out that in all of these things, even without major disasters, with strong leaders in community, and there are many of them all across Western Australia, all across Australia, I've met many of them who are really inspiring people leading in their communities. It's still possible for transformational change. The resourcing is always a challenge, of course, but leadership is really fundamental. Now, I want to conclude with some reasons for optimism, because this sounds bleak. The hazards are increasing. They're increasing rapidly. The scale and destructiveness will increase. Why should we be optimistic about this? Well, there are a few reasons there's reason for optimism. First, in Australia, there's actually, notwithstanding the elections, there is actually strong bipartisan support for climate adaptation and resilience building measures. A lot of the key federal legislation that passed recently, Future Drought Fund, the Emergency Response Fund, all of these have big funding to build resilience, and they passed with bipartisan support. So even if there's disagreement on how quickly to phase out coal or these measures to reduce greenhouse gases, at least in terms of the adaptation, there's consensus that we need to be acting fast. Scott Morrison recently said, as he was touring Lismore in the floods, it's getting harder to live in Australia because of climate change. That's paraphrasing what he said. And certainly all across Australia, we're seeing that that is true. And the other reason for optimism is that there is accelerating action to reduce greenhouse gases. This is really fundamental. This is really fundamental. Whatever we do to reduce our risk of disasters and build our resilience, we'll be overwhelmed by the scale of the hazards climate change is amplifying. So the single most urgent risk treatment is to reduce greenhouse gases as rapidly as possible. And that's not just in Australia. If Australia did that and the rest of the world didn't, we would be a mess. The climate would, of course, continue to change, to warm. But Australia and the rest of the world reduce greenhouse gases as rapidly as possible. We don't have a lot of time. As I mentioned, if we wait for the impacts to be extraordinarily obvious, and they're becoming that way anyway, it will be too late to prevent far worse because of this momentum in the climate that will continue once we actually reduce. It just will keep warming. So it is the most important risk treatment. But additionally, it's important to note that renewable energy technology is just exploding. It is becoming so cost-effective and competitive with coal, with both new coal plants and even continuing to run existing coal-fired plants. That transition is going to accelerate. The costs of renewables is dropping fast, and the market force will accelerate this transformation to renewables and reducing greenhouse gases. The governments could really help accelerate that, and they should, given the scale of the risk. But the market will also make that happen efficiently and faster than we realize. And finally, there's public opinion in Australia overwhelmingly wants strong action on climate change. And that mirrors public opinion globally. And so these pressures will increase. And finally, there's a reason for optimism that's also a reason to be for pessimism, ironically. And that is that I mentioned before that what I've seen globally is after big disasters, there's this big step change in resilience. Well, that's what we're going to see now. We're going to see multiple big disasters following one from the other and often reinforcing each other. And so the political will to act is going to change really quickly. It already did in Black Summer. There'll be huge additional funding following the floods on the East Coast. And the next hazard is around the corner. So in a way, I'm optimistic because I'm pessimistic that we're going to face these enormous challenges. I'll end there. I hope I haven't left you feeling too despondent. I'm actually quite optimistic based on what I've seen happening in communities around the world and here in Australia, mostly in Queensland, but I'm sure you're each aware of examples in WA where great work is happening. But we've got a huge challenge ahead of us if we want to protect our invaluable, irreplaceable heritage, cultural heritage. And the first step is appreciating the scale of the challenge we have, and then hopefully beginning some of those transformational measures that, including reducing greenhouse gases, that will enable us to get over this and hopefully for our communities to continue to thrive across Australia. So thank you very much for listening. I wish it would have been great to be able to speak with you and learn from you about what you're doing in your communities to protect heritage. And I hope this is a really great meeting and look forward to hearing about the results. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Glass, for giving us insight into what we are facing going forward and setting the scene for what this whole conference is about. I'm very optimistic for the future because we're here having this conversation and opening this discourse over the next 2 days. We're going to take a short break and we will be back with you in around 15 minutes. Thank you so much.